get started. So thank you so much for coming. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Vincent Mosco. Dr. Mosco is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, in Canada. He's had an impressive and distinguished career, so I'm only going to mention some of the highlights of his accomplishments. In 2004, Dr. Mosco received the Dallas W. Smythe Award for Outstanding Achievement in Communication Research. His book, The Digital Sublime, won the 2005 Olson Award for Outstanding Book in Rhetoric and Cultural Studies. His latest book, which I believe we'll be hearing about today, To the Cloud, was named 2014 Outstanding Academic Title by Choice Magazine. What I like about Dr. Mosco's work is that not only is it incredibly necessary in tackling issues of fabrics of socio-technical meshes and complications, but that he's also eminently and refreshingly readable. So if you haven't had a chance to read his work, I mean, it's incredibly accessible without sacrificing any of the political import. So it's wonderful to have him give the first CATS Colloquium of the year. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Vincent Mosco.
Thank you, Jessa. It's wonderful to be here, and I first want to thank the Annenberg School for Communication for their kind invitation to be a part of the LEU CATS Colloquium. Although I never had the opportunity to meet Professor Katz, I knew and admired his work. As a fellow sociologist and communication scholar, and a fellow binational one at that, I've appreciated his multidisciplinary and genuinely global perspective. I'd also like to thank three people who have influenced my research on new technology. These include Daniel Bell, my supervisor at Harvard, who taught me to stay ahead of the technological curve. Sometimes successful, sometimes not, but look ahead. Thanks also to Anthony Ottinger, a mentor and colleague who ran the Harvard Program on Information Resources Policy, and from whom I learned about the politics of public policy. And finally, I want to thank Dallas Smythe, a fellow Canadian, who taught me about the tightrope walk that is critical research. Now, this talk builds on my recent book, To the Cloud, Big Data in a Turbulent World. I have just a few slides, so I'm going to focus your eyes, hopefully, on me and my ideas. My son-in-law suggested an alternative title, which may be more appropriate. He has a great sense of humor. But let's get on with it. On March 12th of 2014, Google called on the world to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the internet, which was born, in its view, when the first web browser was released to the public. Although the earliest internet communication dated back to 1969, only those few with advanced technical skills could use it. And with the arrival of graphical browsers, the internet was open to all of us, and Google, with considerable help from the US government, took off to become one of the richest corporations in the world. By 1993, the internet was so widespread that the New Yorker magazine could publish a cartoon that remains its most viewed, featuring, as you may know, a dog sitting in front of a computer screen and telling a fellow canine, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Now, even as the tech world celebrated the internet's adulthood, the next internet was emerging from infancy. Google acknowledged as much when in a revealing 2015 interview. The company's head of search declared that the search engine, which helped to define the internet, was now a legacy system, a euphemism for still useful, but soon destined for the trash heap. Now Google, along with other large firms and small startups, is hoping to develop new forms of mobile-friendly search engines appropriate to the next internet. Now, it would be presumptuous to map out the precise composition of this next stage in the digital world, but it's reasonable to conclude that the next internet may do more to disrupt the world than its older sibling. The next internet is far from fully formed and still bears some of the characteristics of the one born in 1969. But it is growing rapidly and already challenging its founder's vision of a democratic, decentralized, and pluralistic digital world. The next internet brings together three interconnected systems: cloud computing, big data analytics, and what's called the Internet of Things. Boiled down, it promises companies and government agencies centralized data storage and services, and vast digital factories that process and analyze massive streams of information gathered by networked sensors stored in every possible consumer, industrial, and office device, as well as in living bodies. But it is also creating major environmental, privacy, and labor challenges, and I'll talk about these today. The brilliance of the original internet was figuring out how to get a decentralized, distributed world of servers to talk to one another, and thereby connect users through simple universal software standards. This began to change with the growth of cloud computing, the first building block of the next internet. The cloud is a system for storing, processing, and distributing data, applications, and software using remote computers that provide IT services on demand for a fee. Familiar examples include Google's Gmail, the online storage company Dropbox, and Microsoft Office, which increasingly distributes its widely used word processing and business software through the cloud for a monthly fee. Now, the cloud enables businesses, government agencies, and individuals to move their data from on-site IT departments and personal computers to large data centers located all over the world. What we save in storage space also opens a rapidly growing business for companies that profit from storage fees, from services provided online, and from the sale of customer data to firms interested in marketing products and services. Government surveillance authorities like the NSA and the CIA also work closely with cloud companies to meet their security and intelligence needs. The diverse collection of servers providing the foundation for the original internet has evolved, continues to evolve, in fact, into a centralized global system of data centers, each containing tens or hundreds of thousands of servers linked together, operated primarily by private corporations and government, military, and surveillance agencies. The leading science journal Nature made very clear the practical difference between the original internet and the one based in the cloud when it called on the US government to establish what are called a cloud commons for biological research, especially in genomics. It did so because research on large data sets is far easier and faster to carry out in the cloud than through servers based in university research facilities. A difference, in fact, in project time alone of between 6 weeks for the cloud and 6 months for the old internet. sparked by such research potential and even more so by a massive advertising campaign encouraging individuals and organizations to move to the cloud, including high-priced ads in the 2011 Super Bowl football game. The cloud's now familiar to most internet users. Indeed, it's fair to claim that if the New Yorker canine cartoon gave birth to the first internet, then the next one began with the magazine's 2012 ad featuring a sad-looking young boy looking up at his teacher and explaining, "The cloud ate my homework." Now, the cloud is more like a data factory than a storage warehouse, because like a factory, it processes data to produce services such as marketing, accounting, customer relations, as well as legal and financial services. That makes companies and government agencies partners in service provision with the companies that own and manage these large data centers. It also marks a major step toward creating a centralized, globalized, and fully commercial internet. The major cloud providers are almost all large corporations, including familiar names like Amazon, by far the world's largest cloud business, Microsoft, IBM, and Google. Through service contracts, most of these are well integrated into the military intelligence and surveillance arms of government. Amazon, for example, provides cloud computing storage and services for both the CIA through a $600 million contract initiated just this year, and the National Security Agency. Meanwhile, government agencies demanding heightened levels of security are building their own cloud facilities, including the NSA, which in 2015 opened one of the world's largest cloud data facilities in a remote mountain in Utah. Big data analytics makes up the second leg of the next internet. In spite of the proliferation of fancy new titles like data science professional that fuel enthusiasm for big data, there's very little that a social scientist would find particularly novel in big data analytics. It generally involves taking a large, often massive, and almost always quantitative data set and examines the specific ways that the data do or do not cohere or correlate in order to draw conclusions about current behavior and attitudes and go on to make predictions. That's the essence of it. It's what we're taught in methods classes, especially quantitative methods classes in most social science programs. So Facebook, for example, as you probably know, takes the data generated by its 1.3 billion users and relates the likes associated with posts about everything from celebrities, companies, and politicians to views about society, products, and of course, cats. Not the LEU variety. In fact, if you have the opportunity, hop on a train and go to the Museum of the Moving Image, which I did a few weeks ago in Queens, which has an amazing exhibition on cats and the internet. Now, these enable the companies to develop profiles and subscribers that are then sold to marketers who are able to target Facebook users with customized ads sent to their pages. Google does the same for search topics as well as for the content of Gmail. And Amazon creates profiles on its users based on searches and purchases on its site. Now, given the limitations of quantitative correlational analysis, especially the absence of context, theory, or subjectivity, qualitative data is generally ignored or poorly translated into numbers. Such analysis is not always accurate, and incidents of big data failures on such projects as seasonal flu forecasts and building models for economic development are mounting, as are the opportunities to make mischief by manipulating data for profit. Nevertheless, for simple questions such as what are the likes and dislikes of every conceivable demographic cohort, or for drawing conclusions about users based on their friendship and follower networks, The massively large stores of data available for analysis in the digital factories that make up the cloud offer incentives, big incentives for companies and governments to invest in both cloud data centers and in big data analytics. I also think it's reasonable to be concerned that singular reliance on big data in research is paving the way for what might best be called a new digital positivism. Now, the cloud and big data are enhanced substantially by the third leg, the Internet of Things. From watches that monitor blood pressure to refrigerators that prompt you to buy more milk, from assembly lines manned by robots to drones that deliver what robots produce, it promises a profound impact on individuals and society. Specifically, the Internet of Things refers to a system that installs scanning and processing devices into everyday objects like watches, and production tools like robotic arms, and connects them in networks that gather and use data on their performance. We refer to the admittedly awkward term, the Internet of Things, because unlike the Internet we know, which links people, the Internet of Things primarily connects objects, although its proponents are mainly interested in the data on human uses of the objects. The sensors in a refrigerator form a network of things that report on what's inside and how it's used. The Internet of Things is made possible by advances in the ability to miniaturize scanning devices and provide them with sufficient processing power to monitor activity, analyze usage, and deliver results over electronic networks. A 2015 report from the think tank McKinsey concluded that by 2025, the Internet of Things will have an economic impact, get this, of between $3.9 and $11.1 trillion. At the higher end, that's 1/10 the size of the world economy. Even discounting for the hyperbole, and it does take a major discounting in reading reports like this, that often accompanies tech forecasts by research organizations looking to drum up business from the industries they cover. The report is interesting for highlighting likely impacts and for identifying affected organizations. Significantly, it is the manufacturing sector that leads the way as machine production and opportunities for operational surveillance enable more tightly managed and efficient factories, and perhaps even more importantly, global supply chains. But these will also extend, McKinsey maintains, to offices, retail operations, the management of cities, and overall transportation, as automated vehicles take to the streets and highways made smart by sensors embedded everywhere. GE is now embedding sensors in highway lighting to observe, monitor, report on, and examine flows of traffic. Heightened monitoring will also extend to the home, promising greater control over heating and cooling, ordering food and supplies, and to the body as well, where sensors will continuously monitor fitness, blood pressure, heart rate, and the performance of vital organs. This sounds futuristic, and depending on your point of view, either utopian or dystopian, but it speaks to the power of the new technology and to the fundamental differences between the original internet and its successor. Companies have been quick to take advantage of their leading position in the digital world to rush into the Internet of Things. Prime examples include Google's driverless car, Apple's watch, and Amazon's embrace of robotics in its warehouses to speed the work of order fulfillment. Amazon's also preparing to use drones for deliveries. It's testing them, in fact, in Canada now, in British Columbia, the only location in North America that will provide Amazon with test facilities. The FAA will not give Amazon that authority. Interesting. Amazon's also developing entirely new forms of packaging, featuring, for example, push buttons on packages that automate ordering refills. Run out of detergent, push the button on the box, and presumably a drone will speed your delivery. They're promising within a half hour to an hour, depending on your location, to your home. The Internet of Things has also given new life to an old industrial firm, General Electric, which was remade in the 1990s by shifting from manufacturing to financial services. GE has now all but abandoned the increasingly regulated world of banking, only to emerge as a dominant player producing devices essential to the Internet of Things and making use of them in its own industrial processes. Now, along with the benefits to corporations, the Internet of Things holds out great promise for the military because it greatly strengthens opportunities to automate warfare through robotics and drone weaponry, in addition to enhancing the overall management of troops. One enormously valuable result of monitoring every device and connecting them in a global grid of objects is the exponential growth in commercially useful data. Today, according to a Cisco report, only 1% of the world's objects are linked. So the big promise of the Internet of Things remains just that. Nevertheless, it's forecast that by 2020, 50 billion connected devices will join the next Internet, gathering and reporting data all the time. Making use of the surge in data will require both new cloud data centers and widespread use of data analysis. As McKinsey puts it, quote, currently, most Internet of Things data are not used. For example, on an oil rig that has 30,000 sensors, only 1% of the data are examined. That's because this information is used mostly to detect and control anomalies, errors, not for optimization and prediction, which provides the greatest value. So that's coming. How to use data internally and as a marketable commodity is one of the biggest challenges facing the Internet of Things industry. Now, most of what's written about the next Internet is technical and/or promotional, emphasizing the engineering required to build it or touting the potential in sometimes dreamily hyperbolic terms. Nonstop leisure, friction-free capitalism, and my personal favorite, the singularity. We're just beginning to see some discussion of the serious policy issues that arise in a world of massive data centers, nonstop analysis of human behavior, and ubiquitous connectivity. These include the concentration of power over the next Internet and a handful of mainly US companies and the military intelligence apparatus. 2, the environmental consequences of building and maintaining massive data centers and powering systems. 3, threats to privacy and security. And 4, the impact of automated systems on human labor. Now let's take these up. 2 things stand out about the early configuration of the next Internet industry. It's already highly concentrated, and it's dominated by American firms. These are led by Amazon, which controls, on its own, 35% of the market in cloud computing, far ahead of its nearest rival, Microsoft, which remains in the single digits. Amazon also has a formidable presence in big data and in the Internet of Things. The company was among the first to build a one-size-fits-all cloud service that attracted individuals and organizations with its simplicity and discount prices. Indeed, some have suggested that Amazon and competitors Google and Microsoft have engaged in the not-so-fine art of predatory pricing by charging below cost for cloud services and compensating with above-market prices in businesses where they enjoy market power. Facebook and Apple round out the list of firms that use their control over the original Internet to become leaders in the next one. Legacy firms like IBM, Oracle, HP, and Cisco have scrambled to replace their expertise in servicing IT departments that are now disappearing, and they're trying to pivot to the new digital world. However, the need to cannibalize old systems and remake their organizations has made the going very slow. In addition, there are firms that specialize in one or another of the constituent next internet systems, such as Rackspace and Salesforce.com, but these are constantly undermined by encroachment from the dominant companies. A wild card in the next internet, I've mentioned General Electric, which is betting heavily on reinventing factories with the Internet of Things. Now, historians of technology will recognize the similarity of this pattern to the early days of electrification, telegraphy, telephony, and broadcasting. In each of these cases, regulation and outright state ownership were required to control abuses and increase access at affordable rates. However, these remedies are less likely to be applied in a world where regulation and government ownership are no longer in favor. Moreover, as in the past, dominant firms are benefiting from their close ties to the military and intelligence communities, providing them with next internet services and cooperating more often than not with requests for information on users. In fact, close ties to the Pentagon, including its well-funded research arm DARPA, as well as the CIA and the NSA, helps to explain why there are no challengers to US hegemony over the next internet. Certainly none coming from Europe, whose telecommunications companies once led the world. Remember Nokia, remember Ericsson, remember Siemens. Remember, if I can be forgiven a Canadian example, Nortel. China provides the only serious competition. Their government has invested heavily in next internet technologies, going as far as to integrate them into its 5-year plans and build entire cloud cities. Yes, cities. R&D facilities, universities, as well as data centers. This has benefited leading companies like Alibaba, Baidu, Huawei, and Tencent, among others. Signaling that it intends to challenge America's lead, Alibaba has set up shop in Silicon Valley, and like other Chinese firms, is building on its enormous domestic market to extend its reach internationally. Now, a look at the remaining policy issues reveals why the concentration of corporate power is such a significant problem, and why it's essential that societies begin to consider the necessity of public intervention. Because the digital world is made up of invisible electrons zipping through the air, there's a tendency to deem it immaterial. Nothing could be further from the truth. And the sooner this is recognized, the more likely the environmental problems associated with the next internet will be addressed. Cloud data centers are very material structures, and as they come to fill the world, there are numerous emerging environmental policy issues. They consume enormous amounts of electricity, now about 3% of the global grid, and the next internet is just beginning. Moreover, customer demands for 24/7 services require several layers of backup power, including some like diesel generators that have been found to be carcinogenic. Microsoft located one and used its diesel power a few blocks from a school in rural Washington, created an interesting case of environmental responsibility. Furthermore, many data centers require large, continuous supplies of water for their cooling systems. And this raises serious issues in places like the US West, where years of drought have taken their toll. So far, data center operators have used their economic power to pressure local governments to provide property tax breaks, cut-rate power deals, and relief from pollution regulations. Some companies have responded to opposition from environmental groups, especially Greenpeace, which has been very active in this area. by incorporating solar and other sustainable energy sources into their data center power supplies. But as data requirements grow, systematic regulation is required, including a broad review of discount power deals and the giveaways from local authorities, tax abatements, and relief from pollution restrictions. Notwithstanding any progress in this area, the primary source of power consumption in the next internet is in the sensors embedded in what is expected to be billions of connected devices and in the communication systems that link people and things through cellular and other wireless networks. A world of ubiquitous, always-on connected devices is enough to make energy executives salivate. Especially the lobbying arm of the coal industry, which views the next internet as an opportunity to build on what a study for the US National Academy of Sciences calls the Renaissance of coal. As a report sponsored by the coal industry concluded, quote, "The inherent nature of the mobile internet, a key feature of the emergent cloud architecture, requires far more energy than do wired networks. Trends now promise faster, not slower growth in ICT energy use." Now, privacy and security concerns rise exponentially in the next internet because greater connectivity increases opportunities for technical breakdowns and criminal hacking. Indeed, one tech journalist referred to the Internet of Things as, quote, "the greatest mass surveillance infrastructure ever." By the standards anticipated in a digital world where the Internet of Things is fully developed, today's Internet is far from creating a connected world, let alone the singularity that fills the dreams of Internet enthusiasts. Today, about 40% of the world's population uses the Internet at least once a year. It's interesting to reflect on. And as one might expect, access is concentrated in the developed world and in urban centers. With only 1% connectivity among objects, we're far from the promised land of ubiquitous computing and the singularity. But even at this relatively low level, technical problems and criminal hacking plague the system. On one day alone in 2015, you maybe remember it, the entire US fleet of United Airlines was grounded. The New York Stock Exchange shut down for several hours, and the Wall Street Journal's computers simply stopped operating. All of these were explained as a result of technical glitches. Companies don't like to report hacks. It's bad PR. Just as this calamity hit the news stream, the US government reported that hackers had stolen the personal records of 22.1 million federal employees, contractors, and their families and friends who provided information for background check. That's 22.1 million. The haul even included 1 million sets of fingerprints. And everybody knows about Ashley Madison. So it's no wonder that observers are concerned about the impact of technical failures and hacking in a world whose people and objects are growing more connected by the day. I mean, who wants her car, or for that matter, her sensor-equipped heart pacemaker open to hackers? Nevertheless, with that said, the most significant threats arise from data-hungry businesses and governments. After all, the greatest attraction of ubiquitous computing is the valuable data on the behavior of people and the performance of objects. These offer opportunities as businesses refine target advertising and product development well beyond the crude systems that today's internet makes possible. And as governments deepen tracking and control of citizen behavior and attitudes. Consider the commercial advantages to insurance companies that will be able to continuously monitor the health of customers, their driving habits, and the state of their homes. Or to governments that can adjust benefits and other services based on citizen behavior registered in their actions, as well as their interactions with one another and with the things that fill their lives. Or to employers that are even now requiring office workers to wear sensor devices on and under the skin for ubiquitous performance monitoring. Discussions of anticipatory selling, as well as of algorithmic policing, euphemistically called predictive analytics, are worrisome to privacy advocates because they're attracting great interest from business and government. Now, the impact of the next internet on jobs and the nature of labor is also an important policy issue. At first glance, it's tempting to think, here we go again. Because the impact of technology on jobs has been discussed for many years, but especially since the end of World War II, when the computer scientist Norbert Wiener generated considerable public debate by raising the specter of massive job loss due to automation. Moreover, the next internet is creating and will likely continue to create work, including traditional construction jobs and the build-out of the global network of data centers, in the new profession of data science, and in the control, maintenance, and monitoring of network things. There is another reason why it's important to approach the impact of computer technology on jobs and the economy with caution. As research documents, overall employment has been much more closely tied to GDP than to computerization. And except for the late 1990s, when there was massive investment in computer hardware, the long-promised productivity gains from IT have failed to materialize. So why invest in the Internet of Things? Certainly not necessarily as a way to control labor. Well, there are far more opportunities today for the new technology to eliminate human labor, especially professional knowledge work, i.e., what we do. In fact, one expert consultant prefers to define cloud computing as, quote, nothing more than the next step in outsourcing your IT operations. This is in keeping with a general tendency which one researcher for Gartner Associates summarizes succinctly. Quote, the long-run value proposition of IT is not to support the human workforce, it's to eliminate it. The next internet creates immediate opportunities for companies to rationalize their IT operations. Again, from Gartner, CIOs, that is Chief Information Officers, believe that their data centers, servers, desktop and business apps are grossly inefficient and must be rationalized over the next 10 years. We believe that the people associated with these inefficient assets will also be rationalized in significant numbers along the way, end quote. Next internet companies maintain that their systems can break a pattern in business organization that began when the first large computers entered the workplace. Back then, all businesses and government agencies insisted that it was essential to operate their own IT departments, and for larger organizations, their own data centers. Next internet supporters insist that it's no longer essential to build and run thousands of organization-specific facilities when a few large data centers can meet the demand at lower cost with far fewer professional personnel. The process has already begun, and early studies demonstrate that even with limited downsizing of IT departments, companies are saving between 15% and 20% of their IT budgets. That's why my university is folding its IT department, moving services to a Microsoft cloud in the United States. The next internet also makes possible the widespread rationalization of practically all knowledge and creative labor, because the work of these occupations increasingly involves the production, the processing, and the distribution of information. So according to one business observer, quote, in the next 40 years, analytic systems will replace much of what the knowledge worker does today. A 2013 report concluded that almost half the current US workforce is directly threatened and in the high-risk category for job loss. Now, whatever the precise share, and these numbers are always shaky, there's no doubt that the current trend is to use software to move knowledge worker labor to machine systems. Now, we're now beginning to see the impacts on education, MOOCs, healthcare, the law, accounting, finance, sales, and the media. Private and public sector organizations are encouraged to outsource all but their core business processes to companies like Salesforce.com, which specializes in managing vast databases of customer information. There goes the marketing department. A job that marketing and client service departments inside companies typically performed. Focus on the core business. The expansion of outsourcing to computers also raises serious questions for the entire global system of flexible production. According to Gartner, quote, that outcome will hit all economies, especially emerging ones like India that now dominate technology outsourcing. The next internet also expands the range of potential outsourcing practices. Now, it may be an overstatement to declare, as did Forbes magazine, quote, we are all outsourcers now, but it certainly makes feasible more kinds. They go on to say, outsourcing is no longer simply defined by multi-billion-dollar mega deals in which IT department operations are turned over to a third party. Rather, bits and pieces, fractions of a lot of small things are gradually being turned over to outside entities. Amazon is a leading force, once again, in this process with its Mechanical Turk business that charges individuals and organizations to outsource microtasks to a worldwide reserve army of online peace workers. Combined with the promise of product warehouses full of robots to locate, pack, and ship goods, and drones to deliver them, Amazon is the leading edge of the next internet's push to expand labor intensification throughout the world. Now, whatever the impact on the number of jobs, the next internet is already changing the labor process itself. Workers at a Swedish firm can attest to this as they arrive at the office each day with RFID chips implanted under their skin to improve productivity and management control. Now, what can be done to address these problems? A few brief comments and I'll wrap it up. First and foremost, it's essential to view them as intrinsically social and not just technological. While technology plays a role in addressing serious policy issues, there is no simple digital fix to solve them. It will take concerted political action to tame the concentrated corporate power that is now making the next internet to expand the dominance and the profit of a handful of digital giants. It will also take global social movements, stronger versions of what supporters, and I think of George Gerbner when I identify the call for a new world information and communication order in the 20th century. It'll take more than this to build a digital commons for the 21st. Furthermore, we need to make environmental protection and sustainability central to all decision-making about the next internet. It's also important to rethink privacy as the human right of access to the psychological space essential to develop individual autonomy. Above all, privacy is an essential right of citizenship and not a tradable commodity. Protection of personal, interpersonal, and autonomous space from commercial and government surveillance must be central to the choices we make about the next internet. Finally, we need social policies about employment and income that address the state of human labor in an age when automation threatens jobs, including now those of the white-collar workforce, and massive, invasive surveillance threatens worker dignity. Does this mean we should reopen the discussion that Richard Nixon opened in the early 1970s about a guaranteed annual income? What is the right balance between job creation and such a guaranteed income? How can we facilitate organizing digital workers who tend to be employed in the gig economy of precarious jobs? Our unions at Gawker, Salon, and Vice, all pioneering web-based successes, good models for the future. The digital world's at a critical juncture, represented by two clashing visions. The first imagines a democratic society where information is fully accessible to all citizens as an essential service. In this vision, information is managed through forms of regulation and control that are governed by representative institutions whose goal is the fullest possible access and control for the greatest number of citizens. Governance might take multiple forms in this vision, including different combinations of centralized and decentralized approaches at local, regional, national, and international levels. The second envisions a world controlled by global corporations and the surveillance and intelligence arms of national governments, whether it be the United States or the Chinese government. Under this model, the market is the leading force shaping decisions about the production, distribution, and exchange of information, and corporations with market power hold the most influence. In this fundamentally undemocratic world, digital behemoths share power with governments that make full use of technology for surveillance, control, and coercion. Now, permit me to conclude with reference to a thoughtful computer pioneer from my home country. 50 years ago, long before the first internet, the Canadian scholar and policy analyst Douglas Parkhill chose the democratic vision in his book about the need to create a global system of computer utilities that would guarantee public control and universal access. Social movements had helped to tame private monopoly power over essential resources like water and electricity by making them public utilities. Parkhill made the case that information was no less essential and no less in need of public control. The next internet is an opportunity to build on this vision. Thank you.
I even noticed you were using terms that I think of as sort of etymological predecessors to the Internet of Things, right? The Internet of Things isn't coming out of a vacuum. It's sort of replacing what we used to call ubiquitous computing or pervasive computing in HCI world. And I'm sort of following Virginia Eubanks here and thinking about the ways that the Internet of Things is already here for people who are incredibly marginalized, right? So we have this disconnect between how the Internet of Things is marketed, which is almost always in terms of like the middle class home. Your refrigerator will talk to your phone, and then when you're at Whole Foods, you'll already know what crazy recipe you're going to have for your Blue Apron, you know, like whatever. But this is already being experienced in a very pervasive way by people who are, say, monitored at home during their probation, or people who are using EBT cards and food stamps, and then accountable for that when they try to, go to their local probation officer or whatever in order to sort of manage their daycare, things like that. So what is it about the Internet of Things that is making it a successful paradigm or myth now? Like, why is it successful now in 2015? And also, what does it mean that the examples that we see associated with it are of middle-class heteronormativity rather than, say, the industrial prison complex?
Well, I think it's interesting to see the model of the next internet replicating in many ways in the rollout of discourses, public relations, advertising, and the like. It's very similar to what we saw in the case of the telephone, broadcasting, and other new technologies. The pitch is made to the middle class as the thing to do. And that is certainly the case, at least on the consumer side of the next internet. Let's not forget that there's an enormous pitch being made to industrial and white-collar corporations to make more efficient, their factories, their offices, and I don't want to underestimate the significance of this, global supply chains. So it's a similar kind of discursive presentation. Your first part had to do with?
Ubiquitous computing and pervasive computing being replaced by Internet of Things, which I guess was first coined in like 2006, but it's really come into its own as a term.
And it's certainly come into its own, I would argue, because the technologies have come into their own. The concern I have, and the reason I latch on to the next internet, and I understand the discursive significance of doing that, is that we've tended to silo new technologies. So there are the cloud people, there are the data analytics people, there are the IoT people, there are the mobile people. And what I think we need as thinking citizens to do is understand that this is convergent and all of a piece, part of a wider system of systems. So whether we ultimately call it the next internet or something else, I think it's vital that we see the ways in which these technologies are becoming interconnected. So you don't talk about cloud without talking about the analysis of commercial data and the intensified use of sensors and devices. Way back there, yes.
Thanks, that was a great talk. Brought a lot of ideas together. I'm wondering if we're reframing access to information as a utility and a right, then which agencies are the new sort of media policy advocates going to be lobbying instead of the FCC?
Well, in the United States, I mean, it's an interesting question. I would argue that given the breadth of the next internet, we need to move beyond. Certainly the FCC is a piece, as are other policy organizations, the NTIA and others. But it's interesting to observe one of the more active organizations on Internet of Things issue is the Federal Trade Commission, which has been doing more to produce policy documents on the problems associated with ubiquitous sensing throughout. I'm not sure that the FCC has done much of anything at all other than try to bring the industry together. We need to involve standards organizations. Certainly NIST is significant. Unfortunately, even under Obama, NIST has been largely a promotional organization when it comes to this. So somebody with the government goes to a cloud computing conference and says, oh my goodness, we need to adopt the cloud. And interesting, this is how it rolled out. There was an interdepartmental discussion in the US government about cloud computing, and most of the questions were, well, what is it? I mean, do we know? So NIST is charged with finding a definition of cloud computing. So there actually is now an official definition put out by the National Institutes of Science and Technology. But that was used by Obama's people to promote the use of the cloud throughout all government. So there is now a program in place, not very well funded, kind of moving clunkily along, but to move the federal government to the cloud. I think the point here is that the next internet makes all policy agencies of significance in making policy changes. Certainly the EPA needs to be brought in on this. Yes?
So I now have a footnote to the last question, which is to ask you about international bodies. I'm thinking, for example, of the Internet Governance Forum. But my main question was, if I hadn't been here today, I'd have been in New York at a big meeting in UNICEF, where they are trying to think about how to move data from children to data for children. And they are examining all the innovative ways in which this next internet is being used to bring resources in developing countries, to target health resources better, to identify where the difficulties are emerging at scale. You didn't talk about benefits. Do you see that as misguided? Do you see that as in a way, UNICEF operating as a kind of inadvertent arm of Amazon, or is there another side to your story?
Well, as a sociologist, I think you would appreciate that. I'm being presumptuous here, but I appreciate that the notion of benefits is not a universal concept, I spoke of benefits. There are benefits to governments, to intelligence agencies, to security agencies, and to companies. But I didn't talk about pushback from below, which will be central to anything I write at length about this. I think it's important. I think what UNICEF is doing is of great significance here, as is what organizations of workers in internet startups are doing to effectively begin the process of unionizing digital workers, whether it's Gawker, Salon, or others that serve as the model. We need to do more of this. There is pushback. It's important. In fact, I think there are two conceptual ways we look at this. I think we need to focus, first off, on contradictions, something I didn't do to a great degree except to make reference to the failures of big data projects, Google's Flu project, the big data project that contained flaws in data relating GDP to austerity policies. There are all sorts of those kind of internal contradictions operating within organizations and systems that will not render smooth the rollout of ubiquitous computing. Secondly, we need to talk about the organization of movements to resist, to push back, and to make use of technology for positive gain. And I think that's an absolutely important consideration, but as I'm sure you'd appreciate, the subject of another talk. Yes.
So on the subject of contradictions, you mentioned, I think in a somewhat hyperbolic way, but not altogether, the idea that in some ways the logic of digitization is to eliminate the workforce.
Right.
And so if we think about that logic, then the consequences of it, as this process goes forward, to the extent that it goes forward, is to further impoverish large populations of workers and therefore increase income inequality globally and domestically and all the rest of it. But the contradiction part is, if in fact you eliminate the labor force, who's going to buy the stuff? Yeah. So what about that? I mean, there is a consequence beyond which, and what is the...
Well, I agree entirely.
I understand that process.
Carolyn, we're testing the limits now. I mean, in that what we've been experiencing for the last 20 years, intensified more in the last 10, is the shift of income to what we call the 1% or some upper income or upper wealth portion of the population. And, we're seeing that there are consequences, but perhaps not as significant consequences as we might have thought, given the decades we spent from the 1930s through to the 1970s with a relatively stable income distribution in the United States and the same in Canada. That shifted. So we're beginning to test those limits. Now, it was hyperbole and will always be hyperbole that we will eliminate human labor, it seems to me. Development is always uneven. I tell that to people who talk about the elimination of industrial labor. It hasn't been eliminated. It's moved to China. Let's understand that. So, uneven development will create a different world, but not one, simply divided between those who have work and those who don't. But it does prompt me to return to this argument. And it is ironic that it was the Nixon administration under Daniel Patrick Moynihan who, for the first time in the modern age, raised the specter, and I'm sure it was more Moynihan than Nixon, of the need for a guaranteed income. We've had programs in place in the United States, we have them in Canada, to acknowledge that, but only in kind of piecemeal ways, some still means tested and the like. So now that we're moving in that direction, let's begin to think about that more substantially. Or maybe not. Maybe we need to, maybe market power itself will so assert its upper hand that they will test the limits further. I'm not sure. It's a political issue. It's looking down the road. It's hard to say precisely. But it is a significant issue. Who buys the goods?
Well, I mean, the impact is not just on the workers, it's on the companies.
Absolutely.
They hoist on their own petard if demand is eliminated.
Sure, unless you're producing Teslas. Teslas.
Oh.
you know, I mean, and this, I'm joking, but not so much, in the sense that companies are shifting to produce high-end products and services to the folks who do have the money. And that's been part of the restructuring of the US industrial economic landscape in the last 20 or so years. Yes, Marwin?
Yeah, so I see some definitional problems. Cloud, Internet of Things are metaphors more than actual concepts. And I think that could lead to problems in how we understand them, but also policy making. So you mentioned there is a definition for the Internet of Things. What I'm curious about is where does it stop? Right? Because the economic projections seem to indicate that is the toaster and the oven and the heater included in the economic projections? Or where does it stop at the sensor that's in the microwave? Does it stop at the wireless router? And so otherwise, the Internet of Things is the world. Where are the boundaries for policymaking, for research?
Well, it's an interesting question. Once one has ubiquitous computing, then the internet economy is the economy, more or less. So there will be significant definitional problems. My goal here, and you might call it metaphorical, I would call it conceptual. I think the two are interconnected. That we begin to think seriously about things when we conceptualize them, often in metaphorical terms. In this sense, my goal is to say, let's think about the overall process that gets parceled out in these siloed objects that appear to be discrete, and begin to think about the next internet. I mean, how did we begin to think about the internet? I mean, what is the internet? And yet, it's a term that's used, it's used in common discourse, it's used in policy analysis. We have an international organization that makes policy about the internet. Well, it seems to me that if we could do that, then we need to begin to think of the next step. Now, you're right, it becomes more problematic because this appears to be everywhere. But given that challenge, then we may, in fact, reach a significant policy point, and that is to recognize that public policy about the internet is primarily public policy. It's not internet policy, it's simply policy.
Should we think of a right to disconnect as opposed to a right to communicate? I mean, can you disconnect? Can you not be part of this Internet of Things? Can you opt out of being monitored, of being datafied, of being?
Well, you know as well as I that it's very difficult. That we can make, again, it's a range of choices, and we can make some choices about disconnection. I would never wear an RFID device under my skin, though the author of My Old Man Yells at Cloud, my son-in-law, I love him, he works for an ad agency, boasts about wearing his, no, not his Fitbit, but his band that is given out at the ticket counter in Disney World, which you use to simply wave to charge rides and food and the like. So maybe the next generation will feel more comfortable about this activity. I mean, we all make what we consider to be ethical choices about our uses of technology, and there are a range of them. Can you opt out in some global sense? Conceivably, but I think it's becoming something that's very, very difficult to do, because even when we think we've opted out, we haven't. Yes?
Before I say it, a lot of companies are now requiring Fitbits and stuff like that to get lower insurance costs.
Right, right.
But I had a question about what you were saying regarding Nokia, and I guess BlackBerry would be part of this, and some other companies.
Nortel.
I'm interested in how you interrogate the global power dynamics of that. So, for example, when I read about the fall of Nokia, it's more about building phones that were too cheap to compete with the Chinese ones in Africa and all of that. And so it's a matter of more a question of the strategic consequences of a particular perspective and governmental hegemony. So I don't know, how do you describe how that comes out?
I think there are three arguments you can be made, and my argument here is to lean toward one that doesn't get much attention. The first is you can attribute it to business competence, that Nokia wasn't as good as Apple at making phones, and it lost out in the race. We hear about that. That's number one. Number two is we hear about entrepreneurial spirit, values that gave birth to Silicon Valley, and it's something in the air or whatever that leads certain companies, a version of the American exceptionalism argument, right? Silicon Valley is part of that exceptionalism. I, to a degree, accept elements of those, but I would push us to a third, and that is to argue that the United States IT industry, like the Chinese IT industry, has close ties to governments that spend massive amounts of money on R&D, on product development, that in fact, it's the Pentagon that does the risk-taking for much of the IT industry. It doesn't have the same market test that they do. And the same operates in China, where their leading companies arose in part because of government support. So how do I explain the global dynamics? I'd say the first two are elements in this, but that we need to pay far more attention to the third. It doesn't make good Hollywood filmmaking, right? It's not, Jobs the movie. But it's important to understand that DARPA, the NSA, whose budget is still not public, but is massively in the billions, and much of this is spent on good research and development work that is shifted over to Silicon Valley when it comes to developing products, and in return, the Valley turns over data on us to the NSA. Yes?
And also, this kind of follows through with what you were saying about R&D and government and NSA and all that. Part of the move towards cloud computing and the Internet of Things came hand in hand with a global kind of very militarized sort of use of IT in order to kind of go off into the world and fight the war on terror. So part of when I look at this talk and I try to imagine it in another university, in another part of the world, let's say Pakistan, I'm thinking, what would happen if our conversation is not about convenience and privacy, our conversation is a matter of life and death?
Right.
And how would you imagine that the ability to have a critical debate on the Internet of Things would completely be transformed if we included those voices into the conversation?
Right.
Part of these corporations is that 90% of them are in one part of the world, and they don't really have a conversation with that part of the world that's being targeted.
I think you're absolutely right, and we need to have more of that conversation. I've given a talk along these lines to IT workers in India and to students across China. And the discussions are interesting. Sometimes coded in what is permissible speech, but there is more discussion of nitty-gritty, like how do I make a life in this world? What do I need to do to, one, survive, to get a job, as well as to fight back? So yes, there are different kinds of conversations. My goodness, keep in mind that we are the absolute privileged in the next internet. If in fact 60% of the world's population has yet to use the old internet, at least once a year, then we are certainly in the global political economy talking about a great inequality in the system. So that leads me to say something briefly about discourse. I mean, it's not just sort of the substance of what one has to say, it's with how one says it, and I so appreciated your comment about accessibility of language. this is, I mean, our challenge as academics, it seems to me, is to be theoretical, but to be theoretical in a way that communicates ideas and their consequences. So I took a little issue, Merwin, with your comment about, it's not concept, it's metaphor. Yes, I understand, and you weren't intending to split hairs, but we often do that. We engage in kind of conceptual duels when in fact what we're trying to do is to communicate a range of social problems in such a way that we offer a macro perspective on the world and on technology. It's an enormously difficult and challenging thing to do, but I think we need to do more of it given the significance of these issues, and doing it with a language that allows us to reach people in Pakistan, India, China, and elsewhere. Kathleen? Yeah.
I'm wondering how it is we came to accept Internet of Things, because that seems to me to be extremely benign for a process that doesn't look benign to me. I mean, things don't bother me at all. If they want to talk to each other, let them talk.
Right.
As long as they don't bother me. I think the alternative understanding of that you get if you thought of this as the Internet of eavesdropping, like the Internet of spying.
Right.
Would invite a rhetoric that would concerns that I think are implicit in some of what you're saying. So I wonder, how did we get to just accept this is the way we're supposed to talk about this?
It's interesting. In my book about the cloud, I thought this was important enough an issue to write a chapter about the culture of the cloud. Where did cloud come from? If the Internet of Things is a benign concept, imagine cloud. When you think of these puffy white things in the sky versus a windowless data center that takes up massive acres of land. My sense is, and I've thought of it mostly about cloud, though the Internet of Things, I mean, there is an initial paper written about it, in part because it was with a tech scientist who was doing research on sensors and devices and thinking, hey, what if we connected these? And so it became the Internet of Things. It's interesting as well that many people in the industry hate the term because their argument is this is a new world, it's not the internet. And in fact, they're right. The networks like dark networks and others outside of the world of you and me also make use of the Internet of Things. And so it's not the internet as we know it. The networks are broader, some are considerably more private, secret, discrete. And things, again, absolutely correct. I mean, the Internet of Things, even people in the industry, and I go to conferences and they say, it's not about things. It's about the data we gather about their use by people. And so we have bad terms. But I think it's very important of you to point out that the terms have consequences. It seems to me certainly cloud has had consequences. Just look at any of the advertising around it. And most fundamentally and most damaging is that we conclude, at least at some emotional, discursive level, that the cloud is immaterial and has no environmental consequences. With the Internet of Things, I think it's, again, the focus that you pointed to, that it's benign because it's things, who cares? But when in fact, the money is to be made by a new version of the Internet of People, the interconnections of our uses of the technology. Bad terms, interesting uses, their deconstruction, I think, is useful. And what in a way saddened me about the development of the notion of cloud computing is it's so abused a term that has a rich history. And to offer you one example, probably the best satire of an early data scientist is Aristophanes' The Clouds, in which Socrates is set up and knocked down because he was doing silly things like correlating the ability of a flea to jump with the length of its body. You'll find this. And I thought, how lovely. 3,000 years or so ago, a playwright understood the tomfoolery of budding academics and philosophers. The model for the data scientist is located in the culture of clouds. There is a further history. Oh, sure.
I'm wondering, I mean, you framed this as a problem for policy that we need to be thinking about in the future, but I wonder how much of this is posed as a solution to current problems, and then, or on the other hand, how much of this is just boosterism, sort of like, the need to jump on the bandwagon because it's going to happen.
There's absolutely all of this. I mean, there's massive boosterism. And the thing I love most about going to business conferences is to observe the boosterism, to become a part of it. So I was at a cloud conference, the largest one in New York City, a couple of years ago. And it was magnificent for its boosterism and for the contradictions one often finds in it. So unlike academic conferences, they start a panel with rock music, heavy metal stuff. You've probably seen one or two of these. I mean, where, the MC goes up on stage and, you've got AC/DC playing. It's extraordinary. And so in one event, they brought up 3 experts on cloud technology, part of the boosterism. And so the first question was, what's the first word that comes to mind when I say cloud computing? And, number 1 said money, and right? And number 2 said business opportunity. And the third guy, I loved it, absolutely priceless, deadpan, said, it's a bullshit marketing term. And just like to a room of 2,000-3,000 people. So the boosterism, I think it's important for us to examine that, to deconstruct it, to understand how it proliferates. Part of what in another book I call the digital sublime. I mean, any technology needs to be rendered sublime to advance technologies. And, it can be an innocent thing. It can also be a very powerful tool to promote businesses. And at the same time, you'd have to say that there are certain advantages. One of the things we should be doing is imagining what we would do with the Internet of Things if it were ours. What would we do with it? In other words, can it advance, I know I'm being presumptuous, to advance a democratic vision or set of values? Doug Parkhill's notion of utilities that deliver our electricity and water. Can we imagine a social structure with information utilities available to all for public use? So yes, we need to think about applications as well, and that certainly enters the picture. So part of the struggle is, yes, indeed, political and economic, but it's also discursive. How do we make those terms, those metaphors, those concepts, those technologies in the world of language ours? It's a challenge.
That seems like a great note.
Thank you. I know we've gone over. I appreciate it. Thank you.